Good afternoon and welcome members of the press to our GE Trees in 2016 press conference. I'm Ann Peterman, Executive Director of Global Justice Ecology Project and coordinator of the international campaign to stop genetically engineered trees. I've been working on the issue of GE trees since 1999. I'm joined today by a panel of experts who will be speaking to you about the state of genetically engineered trees in 2016 and what we are planning to do about them. This panel includes Dr. Ricarda Steinbrecher, geneticist and co-director of Oxford-based EcoNexus, Dr. Doug Gurian-Sherman, senior scientist at the Center for Food Safety, Dr. Rachel Smoker, co-director of Biofuel Watch, and BJ McManama, GE Trees campaigner for Indigenous Environmental Network. There will also be brief overviews of the problems with genetically engineered trees themselves, why they are such an exception, forces and issues driving large-scale development of genetically engineered trees. We plan to keep the presentations to about 40 minutes to allow time for question and answer, and of course you can always follow up with our media coordinator Kip if you would like interviews with any of the presenters after this press conference is over. Before we get into the rapidly evolving current situation with GE trees, I want to quickly touch on some of the particular dangers inherent to GE trees. Genetically engineering trees is a much more dangerous proposition than the engineering of annual crop plants because of the unique characteristics of trees. For example, far from being annual, trees live for decades, if not centuries. Some even live for thousands of years. Studies have documented pine pollen traveling for upwards of 600 miles, and a study at Duke University found that at least a small percentage of this pollen remains viable. Seeds are distributed by birds and animals, of course, over long distances as well. Many of the trees being engineered have native wild relatives that are widely distributed geographically. Combined with the distance pollen can travel, this means that contamination of these wild relatives is both inevitable and irreversible. Poplars, for example, are one of the main species being engineered, and they have native wild relatives all over North America and Europe, about 30 species. Additionally, forest ecosystems are extremely complex, having evolved over millions of years, and of course including not just trees and plants, but fungi, soil microorganisms, insects, birds, wildlife, and other biodiversity, not to mention the forest-dependent and indigenous human communities that live there. The impact of engineered traits being released into or contaminating these forests is impossible to predict, but potentially extremely serious. Consider, for example, trees engineered to manufacture insecticide. Insects are a key strand in the forest ecosystem web, with many songbirds, insects, and other animals directly dependent on them. The insecticide may even travel on target. And finally, and this will be discussed more later, the colonization of native forest ecosystems by non-native invasive GE trees such as Eucalyptus. For these reasons and many more, a full cycle risk assessment of GE trees is both critically important and basically impossible, leading to the inevitable conclusion that all forms of GE trees must be rejected and all field trials removed. With regard to this effort to stop GE trees, the situation over the past year has been evolving rapidly. In 2015, we saw significant events on both sides of the GE trees issue, and prior to last year, there was only one country in the world where GE trees were allowed, and that was China, where some 450 hectares of Bt black poplars were planted starting in 2001. But last year, things really came to a head. In January, it was revealed that the USDA had granted unprecedented permission to Arborgen to commercially develop GE Loblolly Pines with no federal oversight, no public input, and no risk assessment. But last year, things really came to a head. The USDA had granted unprecedented permission to Arborgen to commercially develop GE Loblolly Pines with no federal oversight, no public input, and no risk assessment. Arborgen is the world's leading GE tree company and was founded as a joint venture back in 1999 by Monsanto, International Paper, West Vaco, and Fletcher Challenge Forests. The USDA decision was met with outrage by groups around the U.S. More than 120,000 letters of protest were sent, and a direct action was held at the world headquarters of Arborgen, where Ruddy Turnstone, our GE Trees campaigner, and myself were arrested and dragged away by police for demanding that Arborgen stop hiding their plans for these GE pines, and for trying to deliver to ArborGen's CEO petitions signed by more than 250,000 people just in 2015 opposing GE trees. Following the action, ArborGen made their first public statement about these GE loblolly pines, claiming they had, quote, moved on to other things. A mere 2 months later, however, ArborGen was fined $53.5 million for using what the judge called, quote, trickery and deceit to defraud their employees out of millions of dollars, which begs the question, if ArborGen lies to and defrauds their own employees, how can we possibly believe anything they say about their GE trees? We're also keeping an eye on ArborGen's petition to legalize their freeze-tolerant GE eucalyptus trees. It's been 5 years now since they requested permission for these trees, and the only action we've seen on the matter was when the USDA released the petition for public comments in early 2013. Comments were submitted at the rate of 10,000 to 1 opposing the GE trees. There's been nothing public since then, though our alliance is prepared to rapidly respond if and when the USDA ever releases their draft environmental impact statement on this petition. But the US is not the only place where the GE tree issue has been coming to a head. 1 month after finding out about ArborGen's loblolly pines last January, we learned that the Brazilian Biosafety Commission, or CTN Bio, was to meet in March to decide whether to legalize commercial production of GE eucalyptus trees developed by Futurigene, another GE tree company. Actions and protests were immediately mobilized at Brazilian embassies and consulates on 6 continents. 150,000 signatures were gathered, and on the day of the CTN Bio meeting, more than 1,000 women from social movements around Brazil took over a Futurigene greenhouse where GE eucalyptus were being grown. La Via Campesina, the global peasants movement, took over and shut down the CTN Bio meeting. Another round of global protests took place immediately before CTN Bio's rescheduled meeting in April. While CTN Bio did ultimately and illegally approve Futurigene's request, legal teams, social movements, NGOs, and others have been mobilizing to stop the implementation of this decision. And this year, organizations in the remote northern regions directly impacted by these potential GE eucalyptus trees are bringing together and educating people in their own communities to build local opposition to GE trees. Other plans we have for this year: SUNY Environmental Science and Forestry School plans to begin the process of deregulating American chestnut to stop it. These GE American chestnuts are unique among the trees that we're working on, as the nuts they produce are commonly eaten. In addition, the plan by William Powell and others, the people developing these GE trees, is to release them directly into forest with the intention of contaminating wild American chestnuts. Far from trying to avoid contamination, they are actually intentionally wanting to cause it. We will be linking up with both forest protection and GMO food groups to stop the legalization of these dangerous trees and to ensure the forests, wildlife, and communities of the eastern forests are protected. We are also working to continue to strengthen the anti-GE tree positions of the 3 major forest certification schemes, the FSC, the SFI, and the Program for the Endorsement of Forest Certification. All 3 of these schemes currently prohibit GE trees, and we want them also to remove certification from any companies pursuing GE trees. We want to ensure that there is no possible way to pretend GE trees are sustainable and to economically disadvantage the companies that pursue them. And a major ongoing part of our work over the coming year and beyond is identifying and countering false claims about the role of GE trees in protecting forest health. To win public approval for GE trees, industry is framing itself as a force for forest protection and restoration. The Forest Health Initiative, for example, has the stated mission of, quote, exploring biotechnology to protect forest health. Not surprisingly, their initial focus to win public and regulatory approval is the engineered chestnut tree, which was largely killed off by an introduced blight using the GE chestnut approval to open the door for other genetically engineered trees that are much more controversial. Industry also claims that faster growing trees will produce more wood on less land and reduce logging on native forests. However, studies are quite clear. The faster tree plantations grow, the more economic incentive there is to spread them, and the faster they replace native forests. Plantation expansion is actually causing more deforestation than even logging is that GE trees will help stop climate change. GE trees will be faster growing, storing more carbon, etc. However, once again, studies show the reality of the situation, which is that tree plantations, only store about 1/4 the carbon of native forests. So the more plantations, or especially GE tree plantations there are, the worse it is for the climate. We'll be very busy over the course of 2016 addressing these myriad threats from GE trees, and we will be strengthening the global campaign to stop them.
Hi, I'm Doug Gurian-Sherman. I am the Director for Sustainable Agriculture and Senior Scientist at the Center for Food Safety. And I would like to talk a little bit about some of the trees that have been engineered, are in field tests, and some of which are maybe close to commercialization, talk about some of the issues with those engineered trees, why we should be concerned about them, and the regulatory system that is supposed to ensure that any engineered crops or trees will not be harmful to the environment, and things that need to be done to improve that system. In fact, the federal government has recognized that the regulatory system in the U.S. needs an overhaul. That hasn't occurred over the 30 years since the original so-called coordinated framework was put into place, basically directing that the government would regulate engineered organisms under existing statutes that were never designed for regulating engineered organisms, and which have, in some cases, not very good fit for regulating at the time a new technology. And so the government has recognized that we need to go back and improve those regulations. So it's an opportunity from our perspective to remedy a situation that's wholly unacceptable in terms of protecting the public from genetically engineered trees and other genetically engineered organisms. I'll talk about that after I talk about the individual species. So let me start with eucalyptus. Eucalyptus has been engineered to be cold or freeze tolerant. It's an important pulp and biomass tree because it grows very quickly. But it's important to note that it is not native to the United States. It's native of Australia and surrounding areas. And because of that, and because of the nature of eucalyptus, it's not co-adapted with other organisms and ecosystems in the United States. So the engineering, the important point of the engineering here most likely is to allow eucalyptus to be grown in parts of the United States where it couldn't otherwise because it would be injured or killed by cold or frost. Currently, these trees can only be grown in the very, very most southern portion of the U.S. These, with the cold tolerance gene, that range could be extended according to analysis by the U.S. Forest Service by about half of a climate zone, which by their estimation could amount to 3 million acres or more, but potentially, depending on how they could displace other trees and whether additional cold tolerance traits were piggybacked onto this later, the area occupied by in the east and southeast in particular by current pine plantations of native trees is closer to 32 million acres. So only a fraction of that probably would be devoted to these eucalyptus, at least in the foreseeable future, but it's possible with other similar traits that might expand. So the concern especially is several-fold. As I said, these are not native species. They have characteristics that make it particularly hard for native species to thrive in forests consisting of these trees. These are hybrid eucalyptus, so two different species that have been bred together to form a hybrid. So where we do see eucalyptus in the U.S., for example, in California, they're often characterized as green deserts because of the inability of native species to survive or thrive in those forests. And so that would be potentially a substantial impact on biodiversity in the southeastern U.S. There's also some characteristics of those trees that are particularly troublesome. They tend to be very fire prone. They have volatile oils, so they tend to burn more easily than other trees, and potentially they could even be foci for crown fires starting in eucalyptus and spreading to native forests. They tend to use an inordinate amount of soil, of groundwater, and studies by the Forest Service have suggested that at least locally they could have negative impacts on water flow, on hydrology. So these trees are troubling for several reasons, and compared to current plantations of native trees, mostly loblolly pine, those tend to have lower diversity than native forests, but again, because they are native species that have co-evolved with other native organisms, they are more likely to be friendlier to native biodiversity. The American chestnut has been talked about a lot, and it's very attractive potentially as a way to open the door for engineered trees, kind of potentially a camel's nose under the tent, so to speak. So it should be considered from that perspective, in addition to whatever merits or demerits it has by itself. And there are some concerns about genetically engineered chestnuts. One is that the particular traits that have been selected so far don't seem to provide assurances of complete control of the disease. And so what that means potentially is that the pathogen may have a better opportunity to overcome that resistance over time, which brings up a second challenge with trees like chestnuts or any of these forest trees, is that compared to crops, they're very long-lived. And so while we can go through a number of generations with typical annual crops like corn or soybeans and determine if there are problems that arise through the life cycle of the plant, or even after several generations, it's very difficult to do that with trees that live 30, 40, 100, 200 years. And so things like the expression of the gene, how well it functions, can potentially change over the lifetime of a tree. We see that with annual crops with genes like Bt genes, for example, in cotton. And so if the expression, if the function of those genes changes even in the trees over time, that could also lead to potentially greater susceptibility. And we just don't have answers to these questions with trees. There's, compared to engineered crops, where there are also gaps in our knowledge, trees even more so because of their long generation time. Potentially, what we could happen and want to avoid is a situation where we deploy one or several transgenes widely, and these trees are widely grown and take off, and then several decades later, susceptibility to the pathogen breaks through again, and we end up with a situation like we did early in the 20th century with loss of large swaths of forest because of the resurgence of the disease. And secondly, in the southern part of the range, there was a second disease called ink disease that is not necessarily controlled by the traits that are being looked at, and that is also problematic. I'll just mention a couple others, loblolly pine and poplars. Poplars are a native tree also being looked at for biomass and have many of the same potential challenges as any other native tree like chestnuts. Because they're native tree, they do interact in complex ways with the organisms typically found in our environments, and depending on the types of genes could cause harm, especially genes that are intended to counteract or resist insects or pathogens. And depending on the genes, a bunch of different genes are being looked at in chestnut. Depending on the genes that are used, some of them, if they are antifungal, antimicrobial, need to be considered and may potentially harm really important fungi in the soil that are critical to the health of forest trees. So there are a lot of complex factors when we're dealing with these natural ecosystems. So the poplar has many of the same kind of concerns, but a broader range and a different range than the chestnut does. And finally, Loblolly Pine has been engineered and has have higher wood density. Loblolly is a native pine of the southeast, often grown in plantations. This one is, I think, important because it is basically completely evaded regulation by the Department of Agriculture because of a large loophole in its regulations. Wood density can be associated with the ability to fight off diseases or insects, and so that needs to be something that is a concern about these trees. But it's also a good transition into the regulatory system. So the main agencies that regulate genetically engineered organisms in the U.S. are USDA for environmental risk, FDA for food safety, and EPA for environmental risk and food safety for any, in this case, any tree that would be engineered for pest resistance. So that chestnut would probably fall under EPA jurisdiction. USDA is generally the most important agency overall for environmental regulation, and as I indicated concerning the loblolly pine, there is a huge loophole in those regulations currently. The Plant Protection Act was passed in 2001 with the intention of updating the regulation of engineered crops, among other things, and engineered organisms, among other things. And that regulation, in a nutshell, has broad provisions for regulating environmental risk under plant pest provisions and especially under noxious weed provisions. The language is very broad and very inclusive, but unfortunately, after 15 years, USDA has still not developed regulations that incorporate its broad noxious weed authority, and therefore, whenever an engineered organism now is created without the fig leaf of using genes from a known plant pest, and plant pests are kind of like what they sound like they are, typically pathogens, things that would infect a crop. So in the early days, genes from plant pathogens, and I won't go into why, were often used. Nobody ever thought that actually would, had a high likelihood or a higher likelihood of making the engineered tree or the engineered crop a plant pest, but it did allow USDA to regulate them under that kind of fig leaf. Now, however, most of the genes, probably at least many of the genes that are being engineered into organisms, including this loblolly pine, are not from plant pests. And therefore, the companies that have constructed them have petitioned the USDA for basically not regulating these crops at all. And in general, USDA has written back to the companies, including for loblolly pine, and said, you're right, we have no jurisdiction over you, you're not a possible plant pest, and therefore go your merry way. That is not protective of the public at all. Previously, these regulations were also not very protective of the environment because they were so narrowly defined in terms of what a plant pest risk is, again, something like an infection, that most of the types of real risks often indirect, like we see with herbicide-resistant weeds in genetically engineered crops, those kind of risks are not covered as plant pest risks. They're not what you think of as a plant pest, and therefore, even in those cases where USDA had jurisdiction over the engineered tree or the engineered crop, it basically said that its hands were tied, considering those in many types of risks that were not plant pest risks, which the agency essentially admitted could be huge. And so for all of these reasons, the USDA regulations need to be rewritten. They're in the process of being rewritten. But the critical point here is that they acknowledge and incorporate this broad statutory authority for regulating as noxious weeds. And unlike earlier attempts at regulations under the Plant Protection Act, which had very cramped and narrow definitions of noxious weeds, which would not be very protective, that broad authority needs to be incorporated in any new regulations. Just to briefly touch on the others, EPA, as I said, regulates for when there's a plant pesticidal quality in the engineering, as would be the case in chestnuts. Unlike USDA, there are some additional tests that are required by by EPA. However, they tend to be, again, too narrow, not focusing on ecosystem risks, but focusing narrowly on whether certain selected organisms, which may or may not be representative of a forest, usually are not, are directly harmed by the engineered trait or engineered organism. And again, that's way too narrow to be protective of the environment. Both EPA and FDA regulate for any food safety, for like an engineered fruit tree or perhaps for chestnuts. And unfortunately at FDA, this is a voluntary process where the companies decide on what tests are being used. The agency does not prescribe or determine any tests or testing procedures, so it's all up to the regulated companies to do that. It's a voluntary process, and the agency does not approve these crops. It writes a letter back to the crop, to the company, basically saying, we recognize that you are, it's your responsibility to make sure these are safe, and we have no further questions. So again, that process needs to be made mandatory. There need to be strict testing guidelines in terms of including long-term food safety before we can have assurances that the FDA process is going to be adequately protective of the public. Similarly, at EPA, it is a mandatory process, but only requires a few short-term tests for food safety. So again, no long-term tests and not adequately protective. So I'll stop there. If there are any questions, please contact me in the future. Thank you.
Greetings to the members of the press. My name is Rachel Smolker. I'm co-director of Biofuel Watch. And the first slide that you see here is a fact, illustrates a fact that many people don't quite recognize, which is that about half of all renewable energy is actually from biomass. That includes liquid transportation fuels and burning wood for electricity, and also burning what's sometimes referred to as waste, and can actually include municipal solid waste, which is sometimes referred to as biomass. So about 50%. We think of solar panels and wind turbines, but as you can see, they actually contribute a relatively smaller portion to the overall equation of renewable energy. GE tree developers have their eyes on this market. It's very rapidly growing, and they are well aware of that. This slide shows you the escalating market in international trade in wood pellets for burning for electricity. And most of these pellets are coming currently from the U.S. Southeast, exported to Europe and especially to the UK. And in the UK, they are subsidized to burn in combination with or in place of coal in huge, like the Drax coal plant in the UK, to put it into perspective, the UK domestic wood production is currently around 11 million tons, and they are importing and burning, or on track to import and burn, about 36 million tons if all of the currently proposed facilities and existing ones come online. So you can see that they are very much heavily dependent on imports, and especially from the southeast U.S. You can see how rapidly the pellet trade has grown, doubling year on year, and predicted to escalate up to around 18 million tons by 2019, at least according to this industry report from Forest Market. This slide shows existing and proposed facilities, bioenergy facilities throughout the southeast of the United States, and many of these are pellet producing facilities that are actually owned and operated by European energy companies and are exporting pellets across the Atlantic over to Europe. And what you see, the colorful dots are the facilities, and the brown circles surrounding them are the sourcing radius around the facility from which they intend to gather their wood supply. And the point of this slide is to show you how on the landscape of the southeast. There's the majority of the southeastern area that's shown here is now a sourcing area for a bioenergy facility. Now, just recently, the European Commission launched an investigation into Drax, the coal company in the UK, and that was based on the fact that they were that some of the industries that are dependent on pulp in the southeastern United States are challenging the impacts of exported pellets to their own industries. And they say that between 2011 and 2014, pine pulp prices rose 25% and hardwood pulp rose 53%, and that this is because of the market impact of pellet exports. Just a couple of days ago, our organization other United States calling on the European Union to, in the context of their Renewable Energy Directive revisions, and we called on the European Union to remove bioenergy from the definition of renewable energy. So GE tree developers are well aware of this expanding market, and they are working on traits that will be amenable to the growing markets for bioenergy. One of the big traits that they're looking at, of course, is to produce more biomass. That means faster growing trees, or trees that can be grown in plantations and harvested quickly, industrial scale plantations, stress tolerance, ability to tolerate drought, and so on. All these characteristics that make them amenable to just producing more wood, more easily processed for biofuels. And that includes, for example, reducing the lignin in wood, which is a barrier to accessing the sugars that are in wood, which is a step that's necessary in order to make liquid transportation fuels. Most of the liquid transportation fuel effort requires that microbes, enzymes secreted by microbes, are used to access those sugars. And so there's, in addition to the GE tree effort, there is an ongoing and escalating interest in engineering microbes that can access, digest, and ferment wood and other biomass. So low lignin is one trait that they're interested in particular for producing liquid transport fuels. High lignin, on the other hand, is good for burning, if you're planning on burning wood and getting as much heat out of it as possible. And so, for example, the Loblolly Pine that was mentioned earlier, which has more dense wood, we don't know a whole lot about it, but that could very likely be aimed towards the pellet industry because it has quote-unquote, denser wood. On top of this, there's a vision of an entire bioeconomy where wood and other biomass would be used to produce all manner of other products that are currently made from fossil fuels, and that includes things like bioplastics and biochemicals derived from trees, among other. And there's research efforts underway to engineer trees, engineer the metabolic processes of trees so that they secrete chemicals that are of use and of interest for industry. This is all funded, of course, by massive multi-agency labyrinth of funding through USD. There is, among other things, a huge push in the Pacific Northwest to engineer poplar for the production of aviation fuel. And you will find in your media packet a briefing on Red Rock Biofuels, which is a company that received funding through this Defense Procurement Act to produce aviation fuels for the military. And I hope you'll take a look at that. Many companies that have started up to produce liquid transportation fuels have won huge public subsidies and made an attempt and failed, either gone bankrupt. In some cases there's fraud allegations. There's a compilation of those available in the media packet, but the fact of the matter is that to date there is essentially no commercial production of liquid transportation fuels from wood, in spite of many efforts. Lastly, I just want to touch on coming out of Paris at the international climate negotiations came the idea of producing negative emissions, and this was born out of the recognition that we have to, at this point, not only reduce the amount of CO2 that we're dumping into the atmosphere on an ongoing basis, but we also need some technology that will allow us to remove CO2 that is already in the atmosphere if we are to achieve anything like a 2-degree or even higher. If we are to achieve those targets, we're going to have some technology that can do that. And unfortunately, the only technology that's been put forward on the table is bioenergy with carbon capture and sequestration. Carbon capture and sequestration, of course, is the technology behind quote-unquote clean coal that has it really demonstrated to be very effective, especially because it takes a lot of energy to do the capture and storage. But on top of that, it all assumes that all bioenergy processes are carbon neutral, and that if you capture and bury the carbon, they become carbon negative. And this, of course, is simply not the case. If you look at a vast literature on the carbon accounting methods and the carbon accounting policy making around wood bioenergy. So I want to just stop here and thank you for your attention. I think it's clear that we need to reduce demand and protect our forests, and that genetically engineered trees can only make matters worse. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. My name is B.J. McManama, and I am a campaign organizer for the Indigenous Environmental Network. Currently, my main focus is our native lands and our Stop GE Tree campaign. Historically, the U.S. federal and state governments, along with corporate and private interests, have targeted, lobbied, and used legislative processes to both coerce and convince tribal officials against the best interests of their people by allowing extraction of fossil fuels and minerals from their lands. Tactics used in the past to garner extraction agreements have included, but were not limited to, making assurances that little or no negative impacts to the people and environment would be realized during or after their operations were concluded. Any damage done in the process of their operations would be rectified, promising economic prosperity for the tribes as a government and individually for its citizens, and finally limiting the ability for citizens to have a vote or say in the process. There are many examples of these promises and agreements that were not honored and caused great and irreversible harm. Indigenous people now are facing continued and new forms of exploitation in the guise of renewable, sustainable, or green development. These come from genetically engineered trees for energy production. The other experts on this panel present the government, academic, and private entities involved, and others have presented the science-based reasons that the insertion and proliferation of GE trees into our natural world will further threaten both environmental and human health. As Indigenous people, our opposition to these new threats are based on knowledge and adherence to natural law, which sit and unchangeable truths or principles inherent in the natural world that have allowed us to live and thrive for countless generations before the invasion of people who had long since destroyed their lands and sought to continue exploitation of ours. Legislation and acts currently being considered and making their way through the government process include language that on the surface would seem to give tribal governments more control over forest management and energy production on tribal lands. In reality, the language is purposely vague and leaves the door open for the continuation of exploitation of fossil fuel and mineral resources, which now, if not stopped, will include using our lands for growing genetically engineered trees to fuel the new bioenergy and consumer pulp economy. Specifically, the Native American Energy Act includes vaguely worded sections that may be used to not only ensure tribal government acceptance of projects run by private corporations, but also protect those corporations from future liability or responsibility, and then transfers that liability to the tribes. These have and are being presented under the guise of Indian self-determination, when in fact they are cleverly crafted mechanisms to lift barriers and fast-track the extreme energy and consumer economy by corporate and private interests. The plans and funding currently available and being negotiated that are not specifically targeted tribal nations, but may also be used to further promote biomass, bioenergy, and GE trees, to include the American Energy Innovation Act, EPA's Clean Power Plan, Forest Incentives Program Act of 2015, and the Department of Energy's Strategic Technical Assistance Response Team, or START program. These also have the potential to impact not only tribal trust lands, but traditional territories and communities where these projects are being directly threatened subsistence rights. We reject the efforts by the biotech, agriculture, biofuel, and biomass industries, governments, and their agencies to commodify trees for commercial use at the expense of the Earth's delicate biodiversity and climate stability. They do not belong because they have been forcibly contaminated with genetic material from totally unrelated life forms, which violates natural law and threatens the regenerative processes of our very diverse and complex ecosystems. The monopolization of land and water to grow GE trees to replace a fraction of the fossil fuels needed as energy demands increase will only worsen human rights abuses and intensify global water, food face. These trees and their end use are just another way to commodify nature and are a component of carbon trading and offsets that will further displace indigenous and frontline and traditional communities worldwide. Thank you.
So just a couple of comments to wrap up, and then we'll move into question and answer. As recorded earlier, the UN Convention on Biological Diversity has issued rulings on genetically engineered trees at both their 2006 and 2008 conferences. They did discuss genetically engineered trees and called on countries to use the precautionary approach or the precautionary principle with regard to genetically engineered trees. They also reaffirmed the need to address genetically modified trees, the risks of genetically modified trees, only after the completion of studies in containment. In other words, let's look at the risks in containment before we put them out into the environment, and also called on looking at the potential socioeconomic impacts of genetically modified trees, as well as their potential impact on the livelihoods of indigenous and local communities. So this is what the UN Convention on Biological Diversity has said about GE trees, and which Brazil actually blatantly violated when they approved genetically engineered eucalyptus trees, as they are a signed party to the convention. And then finally, I just wanted to mention that there have been protests and campaigns against GE trees since we launched the first campaign in 2000 in Boston at the protests against the Biotechnology Industry Organization. It went global in 2004 and it continues to this day. It's continued to grow bigger and stronger every year. It includes not just organizations but social movements, indigenous people, scientists, attorneys, foresters, you name it. I mean, this is a very broad and diverse coalition of people and organizations that are opposing GE trees, not just calling for GE trees not to be commercialized, but saying that we need to eliminate GE trees and reject GE trees full stop. So this is something that I just wanted to remind people that this is a very long-lived campaign. We've talked about what's been happening recently, but this is a very powerful campaign that's been growing over the years. And this I thought was just a funny little slide at the end here. ArborGen's been having such a hard time lately, and I really think that they can serve as a warning to other companies and entities about GE trees. You know, the public overwhelmingly opposes GE trees. ArborGen has been subject to direct actions and protests. There have been conference disruptions. There have been legal challenges. There's nothing to be gained and a lot to be lost when it comes to GE trees. And Rubicon, one of ArborGen's founders, has lost a lot of their stock value as a result of supporting ArborGen's GE trees. So I will leave it at that, and we will open it up to question and answers. Please identify yourself in the chat box, who you are and what media you're with, and we will call on you for your question. I know there was a question earlier about the link between the threats, rather, of GE trees to agricultural lands. Is there someone who can respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very real concern, and I observed some years ago that farmers were really concerned about the impact of carbon offsets for forests and trees, resulting in an incentive to convert farmland that was currently growing food into tree plantations. And I think the example of corn ethanol is also illustrative, because what we've seen is that a lot of farmers have converted to growing not food corn or feed corn, but corn that is destined for ethanol production, because that's what the market favors for them. And that's, you know, really how farmers make their decisions about how they're going to use their land. It depends on what the market is dictating. So if growing trees or GE trees on their land is more profitable than growing food, there's no reason why they wouldn't necessarily convert. In the case of ethanol, we've seen, you know, also that farmers have plowed up conservation reserve program lands and other lands in order to satisfy the burgeoning market for ethanol corn. So that is a real concern, for sure.
Thank you, Rachel. I will just add quickly on the cropland question that we worked with a Global Justice Ecology Project, worked with Mapuche people in Chile, and the threat of genetically engineered trees to their agricultural lands was very real. Chile was very much promoting and pursuing genetically engineered trees in the mid-2000s, and the Mapuche people were already losing their agricultural lands quite substantially and quite rapidly to tree plantations, and so there was a very real threat that those tree plantations, if GE trees were allowed, would be converted to genetically engineered tree plantations. So Mapuche people were losing their agricultural lands, their water was being poisoned by all the agrochemicals being put on the plantations, and the Mapuche people had been fighting plantations in a very powerful way for quite a long time. So that's just another way that tree plantations and GE trees threaten directly or indirectly croplands. And we have a question from Abigail, please. Introduce who you are and what your question is.
Hi there, this is Abigail with Center for Food Safety. I was wondering if one of the panelists could kind of expand on, you know, kind of in summary, the major differences in kind of perceived risks between GE trees and the GE crops that consumers are more familiar with, like the agricultural crops. How does it differ or overlap?
Okay, Anne had to step away for just a moment. Rachel, could you pick up on that?
Yeah, I think one important point that I would like to raise is that, you know, one of the biggest harms caused by GE crops is that many of them are Roundup-ready crops and herbicide-resistant crops. The increased use in herbicides, which is, you know, not directly related to the gene that was inserted into the crop, but rather, you know, indirect consequence. And, you know, we know that some of the engineering efforts for trees are also aimed at causing trees to be resistant to herbicides, and that just growing plantations of trees requires nutrients and agrochemicals as well. So that's one issue. Of course, you know, there's also genetically engineering of fruit trees that's been going on, and we haven't really touched on that very much here. But public concern about genetically engineered food crops is mostly centered on people's concerns about the health impacts of eating engineered food. And that's not so much the case, although people do eat chestnuts, and that's was brought up. That's not so much the case with these forest trees as it is with the fruit trees. So that's just a couple of thoughts to put into the picture there in terms of the comparison. But, you know, these forest trees in particular, they have such a long life cycle, and they experience a lot of changed environments. You know, there could be a drought one year, or floods the next year. The trees respond in different ways, and whatever is done to manipulate their genetics can present itself in different ways under different conditions, and that's very hard to know or understand without testing them for, you know, let's say 100 years or under many different circumstances. It's one of the reasons why it's so risky to be engineering these trees.
Thanks, Rachel. And I think Oren, did you work out your technical issue?
Yeah, I hope so. My name is Oren Langell, and amongst many different hats that I wear, I'm a freelance photojournalist and member of the National Press Photographers Association. And I have 2 questions to ask here. And what I'd like to know, I don't believe, have any of you touched on how many test plots there are in the United States of genetically engineered trees?
I don't believe anyone has touched on that, and I'm not sure if anyone has the exact current number of current test plots, but we can say that there have been hundreds of field trials of genetically engineered trees in the United States over the years. I don't know if anyone from CFS has a more precise number than that.
Okay, well, that you put that into the past tense of saying that they used to. Are there still test plots in the United States, and can you rate them as, you know, maybe a percentage of how many there are the plots, or are people totally in the blind? Because I'm kind of wondering if the GE producers inform the public where these test plots are, and if not, why don't they inform the people?
Okay, well, I'll just quickly answer, and if someone from CFS can get their mic going and would like to pitch in, please do. There are, I don't have an exact number of how many field trials there are right now, but we can go on the APHIS database, and you can see for yourself how many field trials there are, and we can include that in the press packet later if people would like to go into the APHIS database and look at it and see how many trees are being engineered and where and by whom. But as far as the where, it does not get very specific. In fact, in the database, it's only on the state level. If there's an environmental assessment, it may get as much as down to the county level, but they do not get any further than that. So in other words, you're not going to get a GPS coordinate of where these field trials are. Industry is quite private about them and quite secretive about where they're located.
Well, I guess the other part of my question that I asked, well, if they're not telling, if they're not, you know, saying where these are, doesn't the public have the right to know? And why aren't they telling people where plots are so people can photograph them or monitor them or whatever? It seems like having them in a county, that's a pretty widespread region of an area. So why don't they tell people?
Yeah, hi. This is Doug. There's a couple aspects to that. I think the field trials are considered to be CBI, or confidential business information, by USDA. The justification that's been given is that some of them have been torn up and stuff in the past. So that is a current aspect of the regulations that is probably not going to be changed very readily. But the other aspect of it that is troubling is that unless the experimenter, unless the company or the academic scientist wants to reveal what the genes are, those are also held as confidential business information. So while we can go to the website that was mentioned earlier and see what the general types of traits are, what the tree species are, and how many, we can't really get any information about the specific genes or the specific location, again, unless the operator wants to, to reveal that.
Okay, I think there was a question that was posted from somebody who had to leave, Kat Gilgy. Can you, Kip, read it?
And Rachel, this might be best for you. The question was, in California, there are increasing concerns that biomass has significant climate change impact and that biomass plants present environmental health concerns for surrounding communities. Can you discuss the science behind these claims?
Yes, well, absolutely. I mean, in addition to the impacts on forests that are, we've been talking about here, just because of the huge demand for wood, burning wood in place of coal, for electricity is extremely inefficient. And in terms of the air pollution that results, it's comparable to burning coal in many respects. There's actually higher particulate emissions from burning wood than there is even from burning coal. And there's actually higher CO2 emissions. It's from burning coal. But it's assumed that CO2 doesn't exist, will grow, and they will absorb a comparable amount of CO2. And so this debate over CO2 emissions from bioenergy has been raging for years now, and there's lots that could be said about that, but it would be a bit of an aside. I'm happy to speak with people about that, off of this call. But that's one of the issues. The other thing I would just touch on is to say that, I mentioned there's been huge amounts of money dumped into making biofuels, liquid biofuels from wood, and that's one of the goals of the tree biotechnologists, is to make trees amenable to those. And all of that, for the most part, requires also using genetically engineered microbes that are capable of accessing the sugars in the wood and fermenting the sugars into usable form. And there's a lot of concern about what the potential impacts of genetically engineered microbes as well as genetically engineered trees, and what does containment mean for these genetically engineered microbes, how do they get regulated, and so on. So there's a lot of concern about that, as well as the air emissions.
Okay, I think we have a question from Ruddy.
Yeah, hi. This is Ruddy with Global Justice Ecology Project. This question is to Rachel. You shared what GE trees are gearing up for biomass incineration. Can you say which GE trees are being looked at for cellulosic biofuel? And you just touched on cellulosic biofuel plants. Can you share or touch on how much money has been invested by the Department of Energy into biofuel projects related to GE trees or processing trees for biofuels?
It is an incredible labyrinth of money that has been spent through the Department of Energy and the USDA and the Department of Defense and many multi-agency initiatives that have been putting money into this for a long time. As I said, there's still virtually no commercial production of liquid transportation fuels from wood. even though it's been possible to do that, it's been possible to make liquid fuels from wood for decades. We know it can be done. It just can't be scaled up commercially. That's been the hitch. And there are project after project, and in the press packet you will find a compilation of several of these, and they all dance to the tune of literally millions of dollars in subsidies, public subsidies that have gone into many projects, and they've virtually all gone belly up. They've gone bankrupt. Some of them have been accused of fraudulent behavior and so on. There's also in the press packet specifically a briefing on red rock biofuels, which is in the Pacific Northwest in Oregon, and also recipient of a lot of dollars. I don't have the specific number right in front of me right at the moment, but millions of dollars in public subsidies have been put into making liquid fuels from. And if you cast your net wide enough and start looking at money that's been put into research and development and gone into various universities all around the country to support more and more research and development, it's quite astounding the amount of money that has gone into the whole shebang, shall I say, including, for example, I mentioned GE microbes are essential to converting wood into fuels for most of these processes. So there's a huge lot of money that's gone into researching microbes as well as researching trees. So, yeah, a lot of money.
Great, thank you, Rachel. And it is now 2:07. It's been about an hour since we started. So unless there are any other burning questions, I think we will wrap up. And I will mention that the background documents that have been mentioned throughout the presentations will be available online tomorrow afternoon. And we will send out an email with those links. And if anybody has follow-ups that they would like, follow-up interviews with specific participants, follow-up questions they would like answered, please feel free to email them back to Kip, and Kip will make sure that they get to the right people to get you your answers. So thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate people taking their time out for this event, and we look forward to speaking with you in the future.